Good evening. Happy Friday and welcome. Yay, cheering for Friday. I'm so glad to have so many of you joining us this evening for our speaker program and on a day when we don't normally have speakers, but we have a very special speaker joining us today who has come all the way from the wild state of Massachusetts. And we'll talk a little bit more and give an introduction to our speaker shortly, but I'm glad that you are here because this speaker tonight is really an excellent opportunity for us to dive more into the topic and the research that has gone on in order to inform our latest changing exhibition, which is next door. I know many of you have had a chance to explore. I would encourage you to come and go through at your own pace. We'll keep it open for a little bit after the talk tonight. And then the exhibition will be up through 2026. So you have time to come back, go through at your own pace, bring your friends and family, tell your neighbors, and share. We think that this is such an important story that it is important that we make sure it's accessible. And part of that is giving you time to come and enjoy and take in the exhibition and all of the content and the scholarship that has gone into it. For those of you that I don't know, my name is Jill Ferris. I'm the Vice President of Education and Interpretation. I am thrilled to have so many of you here, to have so many familiar faces, but a number of new faces joining us. So I also want to start out by recognizing some of the folks who made this evening possible. In particular, you get funding from the Maryland State Arts Council through the Folklife program in order to support community-centered events and speakers like this. So I want to give credit to the Maryland State Arts Council for the funding. I also want to thank our exhibition speaker or our exhibition sponsors, and our curator will talk about that in just a moment. And lastly, I want to thank our members. I know I'm looking at a room of a number of people who have joined, who have become members. I know that you've probably been subject to an onslaught of campaigns around Giving Tuesday. And many thanks to those of you who have been able to contribute or who support the organization through membership. It is really a critical way that you can contribute to our local community and be part of the Chesapeake story with us as well. So thank you to those of you. I am going to turn the microphone over to Jen Doldy, Director of Curatorial Affairs, to talk a little bit about Sailing to Freedom, the exhibition, why it's here, and give some context for our speaker this evening.
Well, welcome. I am so delighted to see so many of you here and to learn more about the scholarship behind this exhibition we're so proud to be hosting at CBMMM. And so, as Jill mentioned, locally, this exhibit was supported by Maryland State Arts Council through our funds as a regional folklife center. We have a media partner, which is Delmarva Public Media, and we're especially grateful to our sponsors. We have Joan Reitzmeyer and Bill Ryan, Beverly and Richard Tillman, Meta and Billy Boyd, the Dock Street Foundation, Dory and Jeff McGinnis, and Marcia Shapiro and Rabbi Peter Hyman. And several very special artifacts came to us just for this exhibition from Universal Sailing Club, Regina Hartfield, who's the founder of Souls at Sea, and also Carl Kirkman. I want to give special thanks to the Portsmouth, Virginia museums. They most generously shared the actual panels from their iteration of this exhibition in 2023. But I'm particularly indebted to Tim Walker, who's here with us this evening as editor of the volume of scholarly essays on which Sailing to Freedom is based, and is for his work as co-curator of this exhibition, along with Michael Dyer of the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the regional exhibition, which was hosted in about 2022. So my first reaction, I actually listened in on a roundtable discussion about the book Sailing to Freedom in May of 2021. I think it was virtual. It was still COVID times. It was just after it was published. And my first reaction was, well, of course, there's a maritime aspect to the Underground Railroad. And secondly, well, why have we not explored this before? And I've actually heard this over and over again from people who've come to the exhibition. It seems like it's such an obvious topic, and yet it had not been fully explored before. The sources for the Chesapeake stories in particular are especially rich. Many of the freedom seekers whose stories began with their enslavement and their self-liberation from this region ended with them forging in new lives in places like New Bedford, Massachusetts. And so the maritime highway and landscape that is the Chesapeake Bay is an important player in these stories. And the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum, for that reason, wants to help share this important aspect of maritime history. And that's why we're so excited to host this exhibition. So in Sailing to Freedom, if you've seen it so far, we learn about the experiences of freedom seekers through vignettes. These are personal accounts of enslaved people's courageous efforts to boldly step outside the circumstances into which they existed, to seek freedom and to live on their own terms. And just this past week, as I added to our digital story map in the exhibition, I appreciated anew both the opportunity and the risk that this maritime path to freedom presented. The time around Christmas and New Year were when enslaved people frequently took the opportunity to seek freedom. The diversions and somewhat relaxed restrictions of the holiday might allow their absence to be noticed, less noticed than it would be otherwise. And they also were provided with the freedom to go and visit family members and others within the community. Harriet Tubman, for example, returned to Dorchester County on Christmas Eve in 1854 to help her brothers Ben, Henry, and Robert escape before they were sold to new owners. Very few paths on the eastern shore would not cross a marsh, a creek, or a river, or even the open waters of the bay. So the extreme temperatures and winds that we have had this week are a reminder of what was at stake when attempting escape by water in this kind of unpredictable weather. For example, Tubman's niece, Keziah Boley, fled the auction block in December of 1850 and endured a days-long cold sail aboard a log canoe from Cambridge to Fells Point in Baltimore. In 1856, 14 freedom seekers hidden aboard a schooner were trapped by ice 15 to 18 inches thick for 2 months near the entry to the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, only 40 miles or so from freedom. So maritime routes may not have been as slow, as complicated, or as dangerous as a land-based path by some consideration, but the potential hardships were still quite daunting. Sailing to Freedom is steeped in the sources that reveal these complex narratives. And taken together, these stories reveal a pattern of enslaved people using strategic knowledge, seeking opportunity, finding power, and leveraging outside support to find their freedom. Tremendous work has already been done by the scholars who contributed to this book and this exhibition, and yet there's still more to explore. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Timothy Walker. Dr. Walker earned his undergraduate degree from Hiram College and his MA and PhD from Boston University. He's currently a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and is a scholar of maritime history, colonial overseas expansion, and transoceanic slave trading. Dr. Walker is a guest investigator at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, a contributing faculty member of the Munson Institute of Maritime Studies, affiliated faculty of the Slavery North Initiative, and director of the National Endowment for the Humanities Landmarks and American History Workshop Series for middle and high school teachers titled Sailing to Freedom, New Bedford and the Underground Railroad. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim Walker.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and what a wonderful crowd on a cold night. I just flew down yesterday from Massachusetts, and it's every bit as cold here as it was up there. So I have a story to share with you this evening, and I want to begin by saying how really grateful I am to the staff of the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. I had a chance to tour the exhibition earlier today, and they've just done a wonderful job with sort of interpreting for the space that they have, the exhibition that we put together 2 years ago in New Bedford. And I'm so pleased with the way they have tied the story locally. You know, one of the ideas with the Sailing to Freedom exhibition is that it's going to travel from place to place. It was in Martha's Vineyard. It's been in Portsmouth, Virginia. And what I encourage the local institutions to do is to make the story local by incorporating information and material that really ties this broader story that I'm going to be speaking about tonight to the local story. And I think that they've just done a great job in doing that. So I want to thank Jen and everybody else who's involved with that, because I'm so pleased with what's happened here. The other thing I want to say is that my job tonight, my objective is to kind of give you a macro overview that explains and strongly makes the argument about why the Maritime Underground Railroad is such an important part of the broader Underground Railroad story. Put another way, I want to be completely open about this. I'm going to try to change the way you think about the Underground Railroad. And so as a person who is going to give you a macro overview, I also come to Maryland, Eastern Shore of Maryland, knowing that there are people in this room who know the local history far better than I do. And so I will not be getting into the weeds too much in the details about what happens locally. I also had the opportunity earlier today to visit the state Harriet Tubman historic site, which was just wonderful. And so I learned quite a lot there, but the folks who are the experts at tying and making the Maritime Underground Railroad story local are here. And so I want to tell the bigger story about why this is such an important part of the bigger story of the Underground Railroad. So this is the book, the cover of the book. It's a book that I could not have written myself. It involved the work and the collaboration with 9 other spectacular creative historians, some of them at the very beginning of their career, some of them quite senior, men and women, black and white. And together we were able to put together this really interesting story that again, we're trying to change the way people think about the Underground Railroad. So the title, Sailing to Freedom, Uncovering and then Recentering Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad, part of the story is how we know that this is happening, so uncovering the evidence. But the other part of the story is then putting that story in the center of the broader Underground Railroad story. So that's why I called it what I did. See if we can make this work. This is not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So yeah, good. All right. So as one does, I'm a historian and we like maps. And so I'm going to begin with a map. And this is a map from National Geographic. It's probably from the late 90s or early 2000s. And this is the way the Underground Railroad is usually taught in schools in the United States. And we've got, you know, these broad, long arrows of people escaping from various places and a nod to people escaping southward towards the Caribbean or to Mexico, where slavery had been outlawed by the 1830s. And there is, in fact, a nod to people escaping offshore, but almost all of the scholarship of the Underground Railroad for the last 120 years or so has focused almost exclusively on the story of the Underground Railroad as a terrestrial, land-based story. You get very, very little scholarship that talks about people living or leaving by water. But I want to look at this map and I want to push back a little bit on what the map is telling us. Because if we are to believe this map, the map is saying that we should understand the Underground Railroad as people escaping from central Mississippi and central Alabama and central Georgia and western Carolina and western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee and walking or taking horses or carriages or wagons hundreds and hundreds of miles northward through what was in effect hostile territory fraught with all kinds of perils for someone who was trying to escape enslavement. And as a historian of the Underground Railroad, I need to say to you that the historical record does not back up this view. The historical record shows that of all of the documented cases of people successfully escaping over land, almost all of those escapes began within just a few days' walk of the border with a free state. So if you're going to effect a successful escape over land, you have to deal with a number of the dangers and the threats and the forces that are arrayed against you, trying to keep you as an enslaved person in a state of enslavement. And so almost all of the escapes that we know about happened from northern Kentucky, eastern Missouri, what is today West Virginia, Maryland, of course, the area around the Chesapeake Bay and Delaware, but very, very few, almost none. And I'm talking better than 96% of the known escapes. Almost all of them happen from very close to a border with a free state, with the exception of people escaping by water. So let's think about some of the reasons why it was so difficult to escape over land. Well, one of the issues is that if you're escaping over land and you're going by foot, you're traveling very slowly, 10 to 15 miles in a night. If you're lucky, it's harder if you're traveling with children or with someone who's sick or infirm. If you're lucky enough to have access to a horse, you might be able to make 20 or 25 or maybe 30 miles in a night. You're traveling at night, but remember, you have to stay out of sight. You have to organize not only a place to stay during the daylight hours where you're not going to be noticed or draw attention to yourself, but you have to know something about the geography. You have to find places where you know there are people who can help you. And this overland escape was so fraught with pitfalls that doing it over very long distances, over a protracted period of time, simply didn't happen very often. There are a few cases we know about, but not very often. If you contrast this with traveling by ship, you can travel a lot faster and with a lot greater security once you're on board a vessel and you're out to sea. And we'll talk about that a little bit more going forward. You also have on land all of these organizations that were set up to stop you and to challenge anyone who was traveling without a permission or some kind of license from the person who owned them. So we have slave patrols that are set up from the very early 19th century trying to stop people from running away. Now we do know, and there's pretty good scholarship to show that in the Deep South, there were people who did try to escape from enslavement, often not trying to get to the north, but to try to visit family or to see people in other parts of the region around them. Something on the order of 50,000 people a year are doing that, but almost all of them are brought back to enslavement. They're not making it to the north. So we've got these runaway slave patrols that happened in the South, and their job was to try to examine travel passes of enslaved African Americans that would challenge anyone who looked like they were traveling without the permission of the owner class that, after all, wanted to keep them in a state of enslavement. Human property was extremely valuable to the South, and almost an extraordinarily large percentage of the capital of the southern states was wrapped up in human property. And so keeping people on task where they were meant to be working was a really big part of the southern slave owner objective. So we see this happening from the 1820s to the 1860s. I wonder if we can move that up a bit so that we can see there we go, thank you. Okay, so there. Now, I should also, in the interest of full disclosure, let you know that I'm a Midwesterner. I was born in Detroit, which was a really important crossover point between Canada and the United States on the Underground Railroad. And I grew up around Dayton, Ohio. So for me, growing up, the Underground Railroad was always a terrestrial story. But this is a map that was published in 1898 by William Siebert, who was a historian, a very early historian of the Underground Railroad. He was based at the Ohio State University. And he interviewed people who were operatives on the Underground Railroad and people who had escaped from the Underground Railroad. He interviewed people, had firsthand knowledge, sometimes through correspondence, but often through face-to-face interviews. And he creates this map of the Underground Railroad as he documented it. And lo and behold, it functions north of the line where between slave states and free states. So what he's saying is basically the Underground Railroad operates as a discernible system, mostly in northern states. And so that someone who manages to make it from northern Kentucky or West Virginia or eastern Missouri into a free state, it's at that point that they enter into the care of Underground Railroad operatives and station masters, and are spirited along secretly northward towards places where they can live in safety and in freedom, with the exception of some southern ports like Portsmouth and Norfolk, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina. But notice that the Delaware Bay and coming up here along through the C&D Canal and bringing people towards Philadelphia was a major objective of the Underground Railroad. So you also, rather like where I grew up, you're also living in a place where this was an extremely important part of the story. The Underground Railroad history, as it's taught in the United States, is usually and often and unfortunately focused on the actions of well-meaning white abolitionists. And that's a big important part of the story. But what our narrative and our history in the book focuses on, it sort of turns that narrative on its head, and it puts the agency for escape right on the shoulders of the freedom seekers themselves. Because using maritime skills that they often had through their work as enslaved people, using knowledge that they gained from working in port cities and along waterfronts, they inhabited a world that was much more cosmopolitan than someone working in an enslaved capacity inland in an agricultural job. And so they had access to information and to skills that they could leverage to get away. And therefore, the agency, the responsibility, the courage, the ingenuity that went into making escapes in the way that we tell the story lies squarely on the shoulders of the people escaping themselves. And I'm very happy to see the way that story was interpreted at the Harriet Tubman site, because of course, the focus is on how extraordinary she was in terms of her courage and her capacities for helping people to escape. And I like that a lot. All right, so where did this all come from? Someone asked me that earlier today, and I wanted to share with you so I moved to New Bedford in 2004 to take up a job at UMass Dartmouth. And at the time, I knew very little about the story of the Underground Railroad in New Bedford. I knew about whaling because, of course, New Bedford, Massachusetts was the capital of whaling. If you've ever read Moby Dick, it starts in New Bedford. And I lived about 300 yards from the port, and I was really happy, and I like to sail, so I was sailing out of New Bedford, and boy, that was amazing. But then I started to learn a little bit more because there's an organization in New Bedford called the New Bedford Historical Society. New Bedford has two historical societies, but the New Bedford Historical Society focuses exclusively on the stories of people of color. Not just people of African descent, but also Cape Verdeans who came for the whaling, and also Wampanoag Indians and other Native American groups that were around there. And they started to open my eyes to just how important New Bedford was as a destination and as a terminus point on the Underground Railroad. It was a place towards which people would escape because, well, as I learned, New Bedford offered a nurturing community that would provide labor and a place of safety for people making their new lives in freedom. And we wanted to unpack this. So we applied for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we were fortunate enough to get funded. And we ran workshops in 2011, 2013, 2015, 2022, and I should have removed the question mark because we just found out that we're getting funded for next year as well. And we bring in teachers from all over the country to learn about this extraordinary story. And in the course of doing that, when we began, we sort of assumed that people were coming to New Bedford over land. But we soon learned that a lot of the people who came to New Bedford as freedom seekers were coming by water, and that started to pique our interests. And so we started to talk to specialists who came in, people like Jeffrey Bolster, who talked to us about the fact that his book, which had just come out in 1998, he writes this book called Blackjacks. And what he essentially says is, if we look at the pre-Civil War era, especially the first quarter of the 19th century and the late 18th century, almost 20% of the maritime seaborne labor on ships were people of color, were men of African descent. Many of them are free Black men who are working for wages. Some of them are enslaved, whose wages go to their owners. But almost 1 in 5 of the people working on U.S. vessels were men of color in U.S. flagged ships. Now, the implications of that are that seamen of color are conduits of information, especially when they go into southern ports where enslaved people are working. And free men of color operate as encouragement, not only to demonstrate with their very freedom the hypocrisy and the extraordinary absurdity of enslavement, but also to encourage people to get away. And so this was something that the owner class in the South was very much aware of and also very concerned about. So we take this information, and then we also think about, so if we've got 20% of sailors, thank you very much, in the age of sail were African Americans, we also have the fact that the eastern seaboard of the United States was a highway for ships going north and south all the time, thousands of vessels, schooners, sloops, brigs, full rig ships, carrying the commerce that was the lifeblood first of the colonies and then of the new United States. There were no roads, there were no bridges, there were no highways, there were no railroads. Everything traveled by water. And that meant that the seagoing workforce numbered in the tens of thousands, and 20% of them were African Americans. And so we constantly have this traffic going up and down the East Coast, and that creates an opportunity for people to escape from the South towards the North, and to the Caribbean and even to Mexico as well. The book focuses only on the Eastern Seaboard. It's organized geographically, but there's another book to be written, not by me, about the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean and this whole maritime escape component into those parts of the world. This is a painting that exists in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It's called Watson and the Shark. It's based on a true story. That's Watson, that's the shark. Shark doesn't look very good. Could you move that so we can see the shark? Watson, the guy who painted this had never seen a shark before. But it's an interesting, this is 1778, and you have Watson, who survives a shark attack. In later life, he becomes a very prominent and wealthy businessman. He commissions one of the top painters in the country, John Singleton Copley, for whom Copley Square in Boston is named, to paint the scene and to commemorate what happened. And Copley did a sketch of it, and he showed it to now the elder, prosperous Watson. And Watson says, I told you that there was this African-American guy who was absolutely instrumental to my salvation. You didn't put him in the picture. I'd like you to redo it. And so he did. And what we have here is in 1778, a very sympathetically drawn, indeed heroically drawn person who's at the pinnacle of the composition of the painting is this African-American mariner. And I put this in the program to underscore the fact that if you look at the maritime art of the period, Black people are throughout this art. They're hidden in plain sight. We don't often see them, but they're there. And they're there because they were a really important part of the maritime workforce of this period. So that's my example of that. This is the harbor of Cuba, by the way, Havana, Cuba, where this happened. So if we were to look at the workforce of any southern harbor, any southern port city, any southern waterfront, the waterways down which, the tidal waterways down which the produce of plantations was carried by smaller boats, putting them onto bigger boats and going out to sea, all of that workforce, that entire labor force was enslaved African Americans, mostly men. So if we looked at a waterfront, everybody in the southern ports south of the Mason-Dixon, yes, there were some white workers, there were some overseers, there were crews and captains of ships coming in and out of the harbor who might have been of European descent, but the overwhelming majority of the workforce is African American. And they're different qualitatively in some ways than people working inland as domestic household servants or who are working in plantations, because they have this connection, this association, this education of how ports worked. They had access to information that a cosmopolitan environment like a waterfront or a port city would provide them. So what kind of work are they doing? They're doing everything. They're waterfront dock and wharf workers. They're longshoremen and stevedores, loading and unloading ships. And that was skilled labor because a sailing ship, as many of you know, it has to be loaded properly so the trim is right and it's balanced and it can sail properly. So that's important work. They're working in warehouses. They're drovers and teamsters that are bringing provisions and goods to the port and taking merchandise away from the port. And maybe even more impressively, they are skilled shipyard labor. So they're doing the rigging, they're doing the sail making, they're doing the caulking to keep vessels watertight. They're a highly skilled workforce. And so they're extremely valuable because of the skills that they have. But the skills that they have, they also provides them with an opportunity to get away, because they understand how ports work. Not only are they working on land on the waterfront, but they're also working on the water. They are watermen and mariners and sailors. They are essential skilled labor as fishermen, ferrymen, lightermen. A lighter is a big boat that you use to load and unload a larger ship that's on a mooring or on an anchorage. They are deckhands and even pilots. Although they usually didn't have the title of pilot, that was reserved for white pilots. They usually called them wheelmen as a way to sort of show that they weren't the same status as white pilots. And so the point here is that you have this very large population of laborers who have amassed through their years of service on the waterfront knowledge that they can use to leverage to escape. So some of this information comes from my colleague David Siselski, who contributed to the book, but he has another earlier book called The Waterman's Song, Slavery and Freedom in Maritime, North Carolina. And some of the things that I'm sharing with you, I learned about from him. So if we look at a map of the United States, and this is from the census of 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War, and it shows where the African-American population was concentrated. And it's concentrated all along the coast where there are port cities and wherever there are inlets that would allow the produce from agricultural concerns to be taken down these tidal rivers to ports where they can then be taken out to sea. And so if we see where the African population is concentrated, in some cases, these very dark areas mean 60 to 70 and sometimes even 80% of the population in those zones are enslaved Africans. They are Black majorities by very large margins. And this is also true in the various big rivers of Virginia. Not so much on the eastern shore, but that's even so 30 to 40% African-American right in here. So very large populations, and anyone working on the waterfront is going to understand how ports work. What are they going to know? They're going to know when a ship is ready to leave harbor, when it's about to clear customs. They're going to know the tides and the currents that when they want to follow a tide out, because a lot of ships simply, rather than using a tugboat or being warped out, they would take the tide and float down a river. They would know when the forces of law enforcement are present in the port, and they would know the rhythms of the rounds of law enforcement officials. In other words, they would know how best to secret themselves on board a vessel and be able to leave a port without the knowledge of their owners. We just look at South Carolina. This is a map that gives us a close-up view, but right around Charleston and St. Helena and Beaufort, look at the 85% African-American in some of these areas. So it's really extraordinarily impressive how many people live there. Now, politicians and the owning class, the slave owning class of the South, they knew very well what was going on. But they couldn't change their labor force to they had to try other means to stop this from happening. So the governor of Virginia in the 1840s, James Mason, stated that he thought about $100,000 worth of enslaved human property was leaving his port cities every year. And Thomas Pratt, who was the governor of Maryland, said it was about 80,000 people. So the main ports of just these two southern states are sieves of annual escapes of people leaving those jobs on the ports. And this is not only a financial drain on the economy of these states, it's also a brain drain, because some of the most able and apt and highly trained enslaved people are those working on the waterfronts. So this represents really hundreds of people per year just from these couple of states. Now, I'll pause for a second to say the following. Somebody in the audience always asks me about numbers. They want to know statistics. How do we know how many people are escaping every year? And that's a perfectly valid question. But we have to remember, this is illegal activity. There were major penalties involved for helping someone to escape. And if you did manage to escape, the last thing you wanted to do was leave a paper trail about that. And so the fact of the matter is, what we know about this, we know in ways that really don't allow us to quantify exactly how many people are escaping. We know it's happening a lot because the owner class is complaining about it, but I can't say with any certainty exactly how many people have escaped. So there we are. Let's go to the next one. So again, we know what's going on. Now let's look at the evidence. As a good historian, how do I build the argument to let you know that this is actually happening? Well, I'm going to look at several different kinds of evidence. One of them is from runaway slave advertisements that are often very detailed in the story of how owners thought their human property was escaping. We're also going to look at laws and ordinances passed by port cities and port communities in the South, and that also tells us this was going on. We're going to look at what are called runaway slave narratives, where someone who, having achieved freedom, writes a story about it and publishes it later and tells us how they got away. And we're also going to look at the publications of abolitionists who also tell us about the work that they did in this field. So let's start with some runaway slave advertisements. And this is where we need to move that out of the way a bit. Somewhere else, ideally. Okay, so this is from 1772, relatively early. Now, let me again pause and say, this is something I do know something about the statistics for. From the middle of the 18th century till the end of the Civil War, there are about 220,000 individual runaway slave ads published in North American newspapers. So 220,000 of these. And what they show frequently is a description, a name of the person, a description, rough description of what they are, maybe something about what they're wearing. And then the person who puts the ad, usually the owner or the owner's agent, his or her agent, will say something about how they think their property escaped. Because their objective, of course, is to get the person back. And so they're trying to give as much information as they can about how they think their person absconded. And so this one, 1772, and that is an S, not an F. So it says, as he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get on board some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring or carrying him off at their peril. And so this is Phil. He's about 20 years old, 5'9", but he has some experience as a mariner. And his owner is almost certain that he's going to try to make his way out of the colony by sea. So we also have the threat to the master or the crews of vessels that would help him to escape. So even very early on, we know this is happening, and there are starting to be penalties for anyone who would help someone to escape by water. Here's the next one. So $10 reward, absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday. Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl, much freckled. She's about 20 years old. This is from the Daily Advertiser in Philadelphia, 1796. Who was president in 1796? George Washington. So this is from George Washington's household. The capital at the time is in Philadelphia. Oni Judge was a member of the household staff, and Pennsylvania by now was a free state in 1796, but there was a grandfather clause saying that slave owners could bring household servants with them for a period of up to 6 months. Oni Judge knew that she was about to be rotated back to Mount Vernon, and she was worried that she was going to be sold. And so when the agent, Washington's agent, says, but as she may attempt to escape by water, Philadelphia being a major port, all masters of vessels and others are cautioned against receiving her on board. And in fact, that's exactly what she did. She got on a ship in Philadelphia, went down the Susquehanna River and down Delaware Bay and up the East Coast to New Hampshire, where she lived the rest of her life in freedom. And Washington spent the rest of his life trying to get her back. And so he only lived another 3 years, but even as president of the United States, he did not have the legal authority to supersede a state's regulations that said once she was in New Hampshire, she was essentially free. Now, you're probably aware of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, but there was an earlier Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And part of what the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 did was to say that if you knowingly assisted someone to escape from slavery, then there would be penalties for you to pay. But if you were, say, a master of a ship and someone got on your vessel and you didn't know about it, if they were a genuine stowaway, then you could be free from prosecution because you were not a deliberate party in that person's escape. This is going to become important in a few minutes when we see another runaway ad. This is from our own backyard, Baltimore, 1810. This is a broadside. It's not a newspaper advertisement. It's a poster that would have been posted. And this is from the Maryland Historical Commission, I think that's called. But a $50 reward. This is for Jack Alexander, 5'8" or 9. His object is to go to sea, and he'll be trying to ship on board some vessel out. Note below, all masters and vessels are forewarned harboring or taking off said Negro at their peril. So the regulations are getting stronger, the legal penalties are getting higher, but it's still going on regularly because we find all kinds. When we started looking at this project, we started looking at these runaway slave ads. And unfortunately, they are in archives. Many of them are available online, but they're scattered in archives all over the Eastern Seaboard, and they're not in one big searchable database. But what we started to find was first dozens, and then scores, and then hundreds, and then thousands of advertisements that mention fleeing by water. And so we know that this is really a big part of the story. Here's another one. This is from 1838, January, North Carolina, Wilmington. As very little doubt can be entertained of his conveyance away on board some vessel, I will give the further reward of $500 for the conviction and punishment agreeable to law of the master or captain, and half that sum for any of the crew or other person engaged in this felonious act. 1838. So now we see laws that have real teeth and real penalties, but those tended to be local or state laws in the South. So if a captain is helping someone to escape, what do they risk? They risk their vessel being confiscated, losing their cargo. They risk being prosecuted and maybe put into jail. They risk being banned from doing business in some southern ports. Their livelihood is really at stake. A enslaved person who escapes risks being sold into a much less desirable job than working on a port, probably being sold to a plantation in the Deep South, which was tantamount to a death sentence because life expectancy working on a cotton plantation was pretty short. But a free Black person who helps, free Black people are the most vulnerable under the law because they have no one to protect them. A slave is property, so a slave is valuable, but a free Black person doesn't have an owner and is not valuable as property, and they risk execution or enslavement for helping someone to run away. So the law did not fall equally on you. It depended on your status as being slave or free or Black or white. Other people who fell under suspicion were some of those Black watermen that we met earlier. So here's two people, Mary and William, and they have escaped, and both of them have had for a long time relations with the Negro fishermen on the bayou. And so that's why the owner thinks that they escaped by water, because they had been seen consorting with people who knew how to escape by water. I'm going to finish this bit with this particular advertisement. This is not a runaway advertisement. This is a legal notice placed in a New Bedford newspaper, the New Bedford Medley or Marine Journal, 1797. And it's a public notice from a captain, William Tabor. And Tabor is a significant family name around the part of the world where I live now. But this is a guy who, following the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, is putting a legal notice in the paper to say that he is not responsible for the person who escaped on board his vessel. And we kind of have to read between the lines here to really see what's going on. So, public legal notice. To all whom it may concern, know ye that I, William Tabor, commander of the sloop Union, sailed from the York River in Virginia on or about the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford. That on the day after sailing, I discovered a Negro on board said sloop who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. I knew nothing about it. This guy just turned up on my boat. Do we believe him? Captain's word is law at sea, and no one's going to contradict him. But here's where it gets really interesting. It appearing inconsistent for me to return, the wind being ahead, I proceeded on my voyage and landed him in this port, New Bedford. So I'm on a sailing boat. I don't have an engine. I can't turn around. The wind was with me. I'm going up the Gulf Stream. I had to proceed on my voyage. And I landed him in my port that was my destination port. Okay. He calls his name James. Is that really his name? We don't know. He's about 27 years old and says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. Any person claiming him will know by this information where he is, New Bedford, for which purpose it is made public in this manner, and every legal method has been taken to prevent the owner losing the property in my power, signed William Tabor, New Bedford. Now, he has fulfilled the letter of the law. He has created a legal argument that covers himself and his crew and his ship. This was a weekly publication. It was printed 3 times over 3 successive weeks. And William Tabor, so it might have been the case that Mr. Shackelford was in fact the owner, and he probably would have found out about this because newspapers circulated up and down the East Coast. But by the time Shackelford found out where his human property was, James could be anywhere. He could be in Canada, he could be in upstate New York. And so James has effectively been protected, but the captain has also protected himself from legal prosecution. This happened a lot, and we have a number of these that appeared in northern newspapers fairly regularly. Now, you might ask yourself, people escaping by sea, were there any forces that could interdict them on the water? And the truth is, yes, there were Massachusetts and there were revenue cutters. One was called the Massachusetts, the other was called the Eagle, and there were others up and down the East Coast. But in the 19th century, international waters began 3 miles offshore. And a sailing ship traveling up and down the East Coast would be well offshore because it was a lot safer to navigate well offshore. So, please, thank you. And so, because the sovereign legal limit was only 3 miles, about as far as a cannon could shoot at the time, anyone who was well offshore, and they would be offshore once they left harbor, within an hour or so, because a typical sailing ship is going to be traveling at about 3 or 4 knots, which is in good conditions, good weather. And so they're going to be offshore very quickly and safe from being boarded or searched on the high seas, because that would have been illegal. So they can travel from the south to the north pretty handily without being stopped. Now, southern states, now we're going into the period where I'll talk about laws. Southern states began to be very concerned about free black sailors and the impact they were having on their enslaved population. The Southern owner class was absolutely sure that free black men were encouraging their slaves to escape. So they started to pass laws that restricted the movements of free black sailors in southern ports. The first state to do this was South Carolina in 1822, followed by Georgia in 1829, and so on. What these laws did was that when a ship came into harbor with members of the crew that were free black men, those free black men were either restricted to the vessel while the vessel was in port, or they would be incarcerated on land in a jail set up for them by the southern ports. And the charges for that incarceration were borne by the ship and the captain. So the local authorities would present a bill at the end of the stay, and that could be weeks. So what they're trying to do is to keep these guys from interacting with the black workers in the southern ports who were enslaved. And that became then a huge disincentive for captains of northern ships to hire free black sailors. And what we see is free black sailors going to other types of maritime work that doesn't have them going into southern ports. The other kinds of laws that we get are southern ports setting up searching stations where they would, any ship leaving harbor would be searched meticulously for stowaways on board. And in some cases, they would be fumigated, burning brimstone, burning sulfur below deck in order to drive out anyone who would be hiding below decks. And from northern ships leaving southern ports, this became by law, one of the things that they had to go through before they would clear port, doing anything to try to stop people from escaping because the property was so valuable. Sure. I think they're mixing up whatever the noxious fume, the chemicals that are going to emit these fumes. This is actually I couldn't find an illustration from a U.S. From a U.S. context, so these are actually British Royal Navy guys doing the same thing in another context. But that's basically what they're doing, is they're fumigating vessels. It's also to kill rats. They try to do that too. All right, so the other thing that we know about are runaway slave narratives. And so here are a few of them. This is the narrative of Thomas Jones, who publishes in 1862, right after the Civil War begins. He publishes a book called The Experience of Thomas Jones, who was a slave for 43 years, publishes it in Boston. He had escaped from Wilmington, North Carolina, where he had been a longshoreman for decades. He managed to get aboard a brig called the Belle that was headed to New York in 1849. He was helped by the free black steward, who was basically the cook on board the ship. But the captain was not happy that he had an escaped slave on board. And so the captain determined that he was going to turn Thomas Jones over to federal authorities once he got to New York. So what he does is he anchors the Belle about 2 miles offshore, and he went on shore. The captain went on shore to find a federal marshal. At that point, Jones threw together some boards, probably didn't look as nice as this, but he made something that would float, and he tried to escape to shore. The first mate and several of the crew went after him, but he gets picked up providentially by these 2 northern mariners who have abolitionist sentiments, and they get him onto land. They get him into a safe house. They get him into the Underground Railroad. He ends up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and then in Boston, and eventually learns to read and write and publishes this narrative in 1862. Someone you may have heard of is Harriet Jacobs, who published a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She escaped from Edenton, North Carolina, but not before she had spent 7 years hiding in an attic, waiting for an opportunity to get on board a ship to sail northward. She finally managed to get away in 1842, and she publishes this book, which comes out in 1860, just prior to the Civil War, that talked about the dangers particular to young women who were enslaved, because she had been systematically abused by her owner and by other people. And she makes this very clear in a very Victorian way. So she's not explicit, but she makes it very, very clear that she had been the object of sexual abuse throughout much of her life as an enslaved woman. Her brother, and this is a story that has just come out, so this is a painting that was held in the African American Museum of Philadelphia of a man with a copy of The Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist anti-slavery newspaper. And it turns out that this painting was identified about 2.5 years ago, just before we had the exhibition up in New Bedford. And it turns out that it's Harriet Jacobs' brother, John, who also escaped by water, by ship, comes to New Bedford, signs immediately aboard a whaling voyage, because if you're a fugitive enslaved man, what better way to avoid recapture than to be in the Pacific hunting whales for 2 to 3 or to 4 years? That's exactly what he did. But then from 1848, when he, well, this is when the portrait is done, he escaped in 1839, but for most of the next 2 decades, he worked as a mariner going all over the world. And in 1855, in Australia, he publishes a scathing, blazing indictment of slavery in the United States. It couldn't have been published in Europe, and it certainly couldn't have been published in the United States, but the Australians published it, and he titled it, oh, come on. There we go. Oops, nope. The United States governed by 600,000 despots, which was a reference to 600,000 people who owned slaves in the United States. This book, this text was just rediscovered by my colleague Jonathan Schroeder, who also was a contributor to the exhibition. And he then has published this book in May of 2024 with Chicago University Press. It's bringing this incredible narrative to the public for the first time since it was published 170 years ago. So I recommend this to you. This has been reviewed in the New York Times recently. Fantastic book, highly recommend it. Okay, so this guy, Daniel Drayton, wrote a memoir called, so this is another abolitionist who was a sea captain and who helped people to escape from slavery. He writes a memoir in 1855, and in that memoir, he's talking about Chesapeake Bay. And he says, no sooner does a vessel known to be from the north anchor in any of these waters than she is boarded in hopes of obtaining a passage in her to a land of freedom. So it was absolutely commonplace that people were trying to get aboard ships to escape northward. Now, he also was the captain of a vessel called the Pearl, and in 1848, he tried to take enslaved people from the waterfront in Washington, D.C., down the Potomac River and into freedom. He had 77 people on board, and this was the largest attempted escape that we know of. The Pearl was a pretty small and rickety schooner. The problem was that many of the people who were escaping on the vessel were the property of some of the most powerful people in the United States government. So they were members of some of the at cabinet level and at some of the main departments of the U.S. government. When they realized that their enslaved human property was missing, they hired a steamboat to go after the Pearl, and they caught her right at the mouth of the Potomac River. Wind had failed her. The wind was against the vessel, and so they couldn't get away. And right by Point Lookout, the people are captured. Drayton goes to prison for 4 years, and many of the people who had escaped were sold to the Deep South. A few of them were purchased out of slavery, including the Edmondson sisters, who are in the exhibition that you'll see. They were bought by abolitionists in the North because it was absolutely certain that they were going to be sold into prostitution in New Orleans because they were young African-American women. Okay, so this is the story of Elizabeth Blakely, who in 1920 and 21 publishes her story by W.E.B. Du Bois, but she, at 15 years old, she escaped in 1850. She spent about 2 weeks at sea in the winter, got frostbite, but she managed to live the rest of her life in freedom. Now, let me say something about speed and sailing. She was unlucky because a 2-week voyage north was relatively long. You could get from Charleston, South Carolina to New York or Boston in a matter of a week or 10 days, if you were fortunate, getting into the Gulf Stream. So if you think back to escaping by horse or escaping by foot, traveling by sea was safer, more efficient, a lot faster, and you didn't have to do any work. You didn't have to stay hidden, especially if you were doing this with the knowledge and the help of the crew, which many people were. Now, in her case, she was a stowaway, but and she had to stay hidden. But for many people, they were helped by abolitionist-minded sailors who wanted to help them to get to freedom. Another abolitionist, this is a guy named Austin Bierce, who publishes a book called Reminiscences of Fugitive Slave Law Days in Boston, 1880. And what they would do is when a ship would come in from the south, they would send a woman out in a boat, typically an African-American woman in Boston, to sell things, pies and cakes and items of clothing to the sailors. And she would discreetly inquire if there was any contraband on board. And if there was, then they would send the yacht called the Moby Dick. And this is 1853, so the novel had just been published, and he named his book, his boat, Moby Dick, after the book. They would send the yacht out, they would take the person off, get them into an Underground Railroad house, and get them to upstate New York and eventually to Canada. So he's publishing this story in 1880 after the Civil War. Another incredible book, and this is one you may know, William Still, the Underground Railroad, a record of facts, authentic letters, and narratives. So Still was a station master in Philadelphia. He had a safe house very close to the waterfront in Philadelphia. And he did something that was relatively ill-advised. He kept very careful records of all the people that he helped. And there were over 600 people who he had records of. If those records had been found and he had been caught, he was a free black man, he would have been in very serious trouble. But because he kept those records, we have a good a story of which he published. We know about how people escaped, and many of those stories coming through the port of Philadelphia were seaborne stories. This is one of my favorite ones, Captain, and there's some discrepancy about his name, but James Watson Fountain, who ran a packet schooner that did a regular voyage between the North and the South. It's called the City of Richmond. And in Norfolk, Virginia, in November of 1855, a delegation of city officials came on board and said, Captain Fountain, we think that you're running slaves to the North. And he feigned indignation. He grabbed an axe and he said, I'll show you that I'm not harboring slaves on my ship. And he started hacking at the deck. And no captain in his right mind would tear up his own vessel. And so they took his word for it and they backed off. And he had 21 people on board at the time this happened. And so the story makes its way into William Still's book. But one of the things I love about the Still book, and by the way, you can see it online for free. It's you can just Google the book and the whole thing is there online. But some of the illustrations are just these wonderful illustrations of maritime escapes. So here's another one, and I really like this illustration. This is from League Island near Philadelphia. They're landing fugitives at night, but this really underscores why escaping by ship was in many ways advantageous. First of all, if you couldn't travel very easily over land, if you were a baby or a child or someone who's overweight who couldn't travel very well by land, you could do it by sea. Entire families could be taken off. And they're doing it at night under cover of darkness. This is the moon coming up. But the other things I really like about this image is that it shows them loading people into carriages with covered windows so prying eyes can't see inside about who's being taken away from the port. And also, the Underground Railroad operatives are people of color and white people. So we have this Underground Railroad cooperative effort by people who are black and white abolitionists working together to help people to escape from enslavement. And I really like that about this image. This is a guy who's important up in my neck of the woods, Dempsey Hill, who escaped from Beaufort, North Carolina, but settled in Buzzards Bay in Massachusetts and became very well known as a pleasure boat captain. Incredible story. He's a black waterman in Beaufort. When the Civil War breaks out, he knows where there are charts in the customs house of Beaufort that show all of the navigational hazards in the harbor and in the waterways around Beaufort. and he knows they'd be really valuable to the blockading Union Navy. So he steals them and he hides them in a cemetery. And then he gathers up some of his other waterman buddies and he says, look, we're going to take a pilot boat and we're going to escape out to the Union blockading Navy. And that's exactly what he does. They take and they present the charts. He is immediately enlisted as an able-bodied seaman. So his skill as a mariner is recognized. He serves out the war. And then he goes to Massachusetts where he lives. And this image is from the Boston Globe in 1894 when Dempsey Hill died. An African-American man gets a full column obituary in the Boston Globe in 1894, and that was almost unheard of. So you get a sense of just how valued this guy was as a captain in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, in the end of the 19th century. Another extraordinary local story. Well, this is, you might have heard of this fellow. This is Robert Smalls, who steals a Confederate gunboat from Charleston, South Carolina. So this is a vessel, the Planter, which was a steamboat, a paddle wheel, side wheel steamboat that was armored and put into the Confederate Navy when the war breaks out. It had been a cargo boat for cotton bales and for moving other kinds of supplies around Charleston Harbor. It had a crew of 8 enslaved men and 3 white officers. And Robert Smalls, at about age 22, was the wheelman. He was the navigator and pilot on this vessel. So on the 13th of May, 1862, the 3 officers went on shore for a party, for a ball, and Smalls notified the family members of himself and his crew. He takes the boat off the dock. They go to another wharf. They pick up their family members and they start steaming out of Charleston Harbor. But Charleston Harbor was guarded by multiple fortresses. But because he was the pilot, he donned the captain's coat and his hat. It was night, so they couldn't see inside the pilot house up here. But he knew all the signals to tell the fortress not to fire on them, that they were actually going out on legitimate business. So he manages to get out of Charleston Harbor and he starts steaming up to the Union warships that are blockading Charleston. And his wife had remembered that it would probably be a good idea to bring a big white sheet. And so they flew a white flag so that the US northern ships wouldn't fire on them. And they turned the vessel over to the Union Navy. Smalls knew how to navigate the vessel, and I won't go into the long details, but it's a fascinating story. Eventually, he becomes the first African-American man to command a U.S. warship. He's made captain because they come under fire. There had been a white Northern officer put in charge of the vessel. That officer wanted to surrender the ship, and Smalls said, no way. If we surrender, he's dead. They're going to be executed. The crew is going to be executed because they stole that warship from the Confederacy. So he refused to surrender and he managed to steam the vessel to safety, and they made him a captain for it. Not only that, but after the war, so he becomes a hero because of this, all through Northern newspapers. If ever there was a guy who needed a movie made about him, this is it. Oh, whoops. Sorry. Okay, so there he is. He becomes a congressman in Beaufort in the Reconstruction era. He's a 5-term congressman. He buys the house of his enslaver and lives in it. He uses the prize money that he gets from the book, from the sale of the boat. And anyway, so he just lives this most extraordinary life. And he ends his life as the customs collector for Beaufort, South Carolina, lives until 1915. Really extraordinary story of this guy who escaped by water. This is a picture, well-known picture of the Monitor, the ironclad, one of the first ironclads in the Union Navy. This guy is Shy Hewlett Carter, who had escaped down the James River in a canoe and had joined as an able-bodied seaman. He was aboard the vessel when it sank off Cape Hatteras, and he survived and he served out the war. Even the Harper's Weekly is publishing images of people escaping by water in the midst of the Civil War. So all of this evidence taken together tells us that this is happening quite a lot. Even though we don't know exact numbers, it was hundreds of people a year and from various states. So This is the map that we put together for the book, and it's also replicated in the exhibition here. And this is all the places where we can document people escaping and going northward and where they're going to. And if we compare that to the earlier map I showed you, it makes perfect sense that this is where people are escaping from. How are you guys doing? You all right? Okay, I don't want to go on for a whole lot longer, but I do want to tell you a little bit about New Bedford, Massachusetts. So let's do that. This is New Bedford. So this is from the 1840s. New Bedford had already gained a reputation for being a fugitives, well, as it was called, a fugitives Gibraltar, a place where people could go to be safe. And so my colleague Catherine Grover wrote a book called The Fugitives Gibraltar about escaping slaves and abolition in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And of course, she uses that very well-known image there. This is a view of New Bedford from 1839, taken from across the harbor. At the time, New Bedford was one of the wealthiest cities in America per capita because of the whaling business, but it was also the city in the north that had the largest percentage of African-American residents per capita. So New York and Boston had more actual Black people, but as a percentage of the population, New Bedford had the highest. And it was because it had become known as a place where people could go and make a living, earn enough to buy a nice house, and be protected from bounty hunters sent north to capture them. There had been a lot of people who led up to this moment, and some of them were people of color. This is Absalom Boston, who was a Nantucket and Wampanoag sea captain. He's the first Black guy to sail a whale ship with an all-Black crew as early as 1822, and he's a major abolitionist leader in Nantucket. So why does New Bedford gain this reputation? One is because the whaling business is entirely in the hands of Quakers. And they, by the late 18th century and early 19th century, were militantly anti-slavery. They were abolitionists. So they were more than willing to have fugitives from slavery come and work in their community. Much of the capital wrapped up in whaling was capital that came from Nantucket and from the community of Quakers that was in Nantucket. Another guy is Captain Paul Cuffey, who dies in 1817. And when he passes away, he's probably the wealthiest person of color in the United States. He had shipping interests and land. He was a transatlantic commerce, but he was also a militant abolitionist. He founded the first racially integrated school in Westport, which is a neighboring city of New Bedford. He sued the state of Massachusetts for the right to vote because he was a person of property. And even though he was a person of color, he said, look, I meet the property requirements. You should allow me to vote. And he won. So he's an amazing guy and a local hero of ours. He made the newspapers in England because he took his ship, the Traveler, into Liverpool to trade, and he had an all-Black crew in 1811. And so right at the cusp of the War of 1812, fascinating person. His son was a whale shipmaster, and we have the shipping list of the people on board his ship. And you can see from there, this says complexion and hair. By their physical description, they're using these racist terms, but we know that everyone on board was a person of African descent or Afro-Indian. And so he's running in 1837 whale ships with all Black crews. Fascinating. Frederick Douglass is probably the best known person who makes his way to New Bedford from here, from Eastern Shore of Maryland. And he arrives in 1838. He was a trained caulker, and he does not find work on the waterfront as a caulker. There was a racial bar at the time that he arrived, but within 10 years of his arrival, there were mixed race crews of caulkers working in New Bedford. And he was really amazed to find people of color earning wages freely, just like anyone else in New Bedford. And he writes about that in his narrative. He used a maritime ruse to escape. This is a seaman's protection paper that identified him as a free Black sailor. He borrowed it from somebody else. But he walked the walk and he talked the talk, and no one ever asked him to see his credentials. So this is how he gets away to New Bedford. And he made his home in New Bedford for, his family was there for 7 years. Two of his sons served in the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which is the Black regiment that fought at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. When he came to New Bedford, he lived in this house, which is the Nathan and Polly Johnson house. It's right next door to the 18th century Quaker meeting house with an entrance for men and an entrance for women. But this house, of course, still stands. It's the headquarters of the New Bedford Historical Society, that historical society I told you about. And right across the street is a new park with his statue, was just dedicated last year to the way Frederick Douglass looked when he arrived in New Bedford. And this is the new Quaker meeting house that was from 1822 that would have been standing when he arrived. And it still is a functioning Quaker meeting house to this day. So New Bedford had work for people who knew waterfronts, who knew waterfront labor. New Bedford could always put that work to use because there were almost 400 whaling ships operating out of New Bedford at the time Frederick Douglass arrived. There were more across the river in Fairhaven and across the harbor. And there was always work for people who knew maritime skills. Two of the people that I would like to finish with are Lewis Temple, who revolutionized the whaling industry by designing a swivel head harpoon that made catching whales much more efficient. He was an African-American blacksmith who left Richmond, Virginia in 1830, died in New Bedford in 1854. And we have a statue to him on the grounds of the Free Public Library. And this fellow, William H. Carney, who became a sergeant in that 54th Massachusetts Regiment. If you've ever seen the film Glory, that's the regiment that this is about. It was recruited in New Bedford because it had such a large Black population, but he becomes the first Black soldier to earn the Medal of Honor. And he does it at the Battle of Fort Wagner in 1862. He arrived from Norfolk, Virginia, almost certainly by sea, comes to New Bedford, and then joins that regiment. Final couple of images. Again, looking at the art of the period, there are African Americans everywhere if you just care to look. This is an officer in control of a boat full of white sailors. And this guy who's clearly having a bad day. But you know, these were pretty dramatic incidents that got painted. They didn't happen all that often, but when they did, you know, we have African Americans front and center working in the whaling industry. This is the New Bedford Whaling Museum, where the exhibition that you have had a chance to look at began, and it was into November of 2022. And I'm going to finish there because I'm just so happy that that exhibition has now made its way to the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. Thank you all very much.
All right, I'm gonna let Tim have a drink of water for a moment. And before I forget, if you enjoyed what you saw tonight, Tim will be at the Talbot County Free Library in Easton tomorrow at 2:30. So if you have friends or neighbors or just want to come out again, taking full advantage of his trip, we are partnering with the library to make sure that we can share this story with as many people as possible. I think it is very powerful to come and to see the exhibition, but we want to go to where the people are. So we're taking the show on the road. Come see us tomorrow afternoon at 2:30 at the library in Easton. I know that some of you have questions. I have a number of new faces, but I have about 20 people online. So we're going to do this nicely so everybody who's online can also hear. If you have a question, you're going to raise your hand. I'm going to come to you as fast as I can with a microphone that you're going to speak into so that they can also hear.
Great. Yeah, and I'm really very happy to answer questions. So
Why the use of the word railroad? Where did it come
Yeah.
from? Was it a code word?
right, no, that's a great question. So the first documented use of of Underground Railroad in this context is, I think, 1838. And we have to remember that railroads themselves were brand new technology in the early 19th century. You didn't really have a lot of railroads in the US until it really just begins in the 1820s, I think. And so the idea here was that This was a term that was coined by people who were looking for enslaved people, the bounty hunter guys, and they would say it's as if they just got on a railroad that went underground and disappeared into thin air. So it was a reference to them getting away quickly and unseen. But it was never meant to be taken literally. It was always a figurative statement. Yeah.
I noticed that you got funds to do middle and high school teaching of it.
Correct.
Have you ever had the ability to move it into more the upper elementary, but move into the reading books that are at a grade level that unfortunately more kids are reading at for
Yeah.
third grade or even below?
Yeah, that's a great
But
question.
someday for a rich experience visually and something they'd understand here.
Right. So we've now done this. This will be our fifth time. We have always really left it open to people of any grade level to come and be members of it. We encourage middle school and higher because it's kind of, we feel it's easier to develop pedagogical materials for that level that allows for a bit more detail and a bit more understanding of the complexities of slavery in the United States. It doesn't mean that we discourage K through 6. It's just a little bit harder to do pedagogy for them. You can do Henry Box Brown, and there are lots of things that you can do, but to really get into the sort of the nitty gritty of some of the stories and to really understand it, we prefer to have slightly older teachers, but we're happy to have anyone come really. And I should say that every time we've done this, we've had at least half of the United States represented. So we have people from 26 or 27 states every time we've done this, from Alaska and Hawaii, the West Coast, but also throughout the Midwest. Thank you for that question, though.
Are there more questions
There's a question over here.
coming?
Obviously, there were hunters on the ground,
Mhm.
but on the sea, were there any regular patrols?
Yeah, so again, the main issue there is that the U.S. Customs Service was only empowered to board ships within the 3-mile limit. And so once you're beyond that, they can't really legally be stopped. And so let's assume for a moment that someone is on board a vessel as a fugitive with the permission of the crew and the captain. Then they would be free to be up and around on the ship while they're at sea. If any other ship came close, they might want to hide themselves in case they would be reported. But for the most part, once you're on board the vessel as essentially a passenger, all you have to do is sit and wait for that ship to get into port. You don't have to worry about dogs. You don't have to worry about patrols. You don't have to worry about being shot or challenged or any of that. It was a much easier, much more efficient, and much faster way to get to the north. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, right up here. Hold on one second. Yeah.
I hope this doesn't feel trivial. I used to teach 4th grade, and we actually used to teach that quilts were signal quilts in the Underground Railroad. And I recently heard that's a myth. Can you
Yeah.
help me?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a fair amount of scholarship now. The question is about quilts and quilt codes. And there was an argument made, and it made its way into elementary school teaching materials that African Americans used patterns on quilts to convey information about how to get to the north. And it's a lovely story, and a lot of my mother was a kindergarten teacher. I got my best pedagogical chops from my mom. But it's a really lovely story that we'd all like to believe, but there's no truth in it. That story can be traced to a quilt seller in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1970s. And the problem is that the story then was published in kids' books, and it achieved really wide dissemination. And now it's like, it's really hard to disabuse people of that incorrect story. But if you think about the practicality of it, if you're, imagine that a quilt code is like a foreign language. You have to be able to teach other people that language so that they can understand it. And you've got to be able to teach it over very long distances so that people could use that information to escape over a long. So what we've established here tonight is that people didn't escape long distances over land. And quilts, most enslaved people had almost no time to themselves. They didn't have the materials to make quilts. So the story doesn't hold up upon scrutiny. Yeah. I should say too, since I finished with New Bedford, you're all invited. I want you all to come to New Bedford to see the extraordinary history that we have there. And come in warm weather, not cold weather. But you know, the working port is still there. Many of the key structures that people like Frederick Douglass and William Carney's house is still standing. There's a lot of history there about the Underground Railroad that exists in that northern port town, as well as whaling. The Whaling Museum is probably the best museum in the United States for whaling and maritime. So I hope that you'll all take me up on my invitation to come to New Bedford and see it for yourselves.
A huge round of applause and thank you, Tim, for this evening.
Thank you very much.